Um, okay, I'm Lisi Krall, and I'm going to be giving a presentation in the ecological economics course. I'm going to give that presentation on July 8th, but I thought that it might be a good idea for me to give you a little bit of background and foundational material for that talk on July 8th. Let me give you a little bit of information about myself. I'm an economist, and I was trained as an economist in the late 1980s when the option to study ecological economics was limited, if not non-existent. So I became a labor economist because I was interested in problems of inequality and exploitation. And in particular at the time, I was interested in the plight of women who were making 60 cents to the dollar that men were making, and they were occupationally segregated. From the start, my training wasn't traditional because I was trained in what we now call a heterodox economics program, which is to say that I was exposed to many different paradigms and many different ways of talking about how capitalism functions. That background and the breadth of understanding in economic thought that it gave me has all served me well as an ecological economist. And I advise ecological economists to read expansively in history of economic thought. From the beginning, I was interested in the human relationship to the more than human world and the way that it became structured in an economic system. But again, I had no formal training in this area. In the early 1990s, the human ecologist Paul Shepard, who has written a number of books, one of which is Nature and Madness, which is actually an excellent book to read, handed me a copy of Herman Daly's book, Steady State Economics. It was here that I started thinking more critically about economic growth. I had always thought critically about the problems of distribution of income and had been very critical of capitalism, but I had never actually thought critically about the issue of growth. Fortunately, I found myself at the time in a radical department where I had ample opportunity to expand my interest in this area, both in my teaching and in my research. So fast forward to the present. Since that time, all of my research has been oriented around understanding the human relationship to the earth as it's embodied in an economic system, cultivating in my upcoming book, Bitter Harvest. And this is the problem as I see it. We are caught up in an economic system that functions as if it's disconnected from the earth. At the same time, it is a profoundly material system. I believe that the whole history of economic thought, from Smith to Marx to Veblen to Keynes and on, reflects that disposition. It reflects that duality. And that duality is real, okay? That duality is real. There is actually a real duality between the earth and the economy and the way it functions and its material roots in the earth. So what I call the unearthly philosophers, those that I just named among many others, have not made the connection of the economy to the earth their central focus, okay? Precisely because they were confronted with an economic system that embodied a duality, okay? But that's actually part of a different conversation. So I began to explore this type of economic system because it was clear to me that humans didn't start with this type of profound alienation in their material life. And there are a number of people that influenced me along the way. One was Paul Shepard, who I've already mentioned. The other was Wes Jackson, who's a visionary who started a nonprofit organization to develop perennial grains and perennial polycultures. Both Paul Shepard and Wes Jackson saw the human transition to agriculture as a major shift in human evolution or human life on Earth. And both envisioned it as a sort of fall. Paul Shepard talked about the psychological kind of impact that change had had on humans, creating a sort of madness in it. And Wes Jackson calls us, after agriculture, a species out of context. In other words, the context that we had previously developed in had changed dramatically. Okay, so I started thinking, based on my contact with these people, that it might be important to look more closely at agriculture. And that ran counter to the orientation of most ecological economists and most political economists who were doing work in the environment, because their concentration, and I understand this concentration, was on capitalism and the Industrial Revolution. So in a sense, my work has gone somewhat against the grain in this sense, okay? But I am of the mind that deeply rooted analyses are really critical. I was also fortunate to run across John Gowdy. John and I had similar backgrounds in that we both were anthropologists as undergraduates. And we both had an appreciation for hunter-gatherers and also for the significance of the agricultural revolution. And John came to me one day, and we had been working together on other projects. And he asked me if I thought it would be worth looking at social insects, agricultural insects, to see if there was a similarity between them and humans when humans made the transition to agriculture. Honestly, I'm probably the only person he could have tapped that thought this was a good idea, but I jumped on it. That idea and the predisposition about the significance of agriculture that I already had, and my training as a radical economist, which always taught me to question everything, sent me on a decade-long project that resulted in some foundational work with John on ultra-sociality, and then to my particular focus on the formation of economic systems, and in particular, an economic system that established a duality between humans and Earth. When I talk to you on the 8th, I will extend the conversation to a discussion of capitalism, because capitalism represents the apogee of the system that began to take hold with agriculture. It is, without doubt, the legacy and extension of that system. And I'll talk more fully about that. But here, what I want to do is just get into the weeds of the agricultural revolution a little bit to give you a sense of how you might view how it emerged as a system. The exploration of what happened to humans when they made the transition to agriculture and why it happened gave me a greater appreciation for the complexity of the formation of economic systems and the processes that influence that formation. The fact that humans weren't the only species to make the transition to agriculture made the picture even more complex and intriguing. And it wasn't just that some species of insects had made the transition to agriculture that was so compelling. It was that in very fundamental ways, the structure and dynamic of their material life mirrored that of humans after humans made this transition. Maybe I should say it in the opposite direction. Humans mirrored agricultural insects because they came to agriculture before humans did. All were highly expansionary, interdependent, employing extensive division of labor around cultivation. And these species had almost nothing else in common. Certainly, it wasn't individual intelligence that had moved them to agriculture because they didn't have this in common. It was the evolution of the collective. It was here that I tapped into evolution. To think about that commonality between insects that cultivate and humans that made the transition to agriculture. But it was the evolution, again, not of the individual, but the evolution of the group, the evolution of the collective, the social evolution of these species that was my focus. And I want to say that moving into the realm of evolution to think about economic systems was a huge step for me, and an uncomfortable one at that, because I did not like the deterministic overlay it seemed to imply for an economic system, and particularly for an economic system that I think needs to change. So it was very uncomfortable. But these are the things that I noticed. It was insect superorganisms that evolved to engage agriculture. That is, those insects that had already evolved a certain level of sociality. Okay, so a certain level of evolved sociality and group formation seemed a precondition for agriculture. And it was the same with humans. Okay, humans had already developed a capacity for culture, an ability to engage a division of labor, a capacity for institutional life before they ever came to agriculture. So this level of evolved sociality, again, seemed a precondition for the engagement of agriculture. Now, as an aside, you can explain that evolved sociality using, in evolutionary biology, what they call group selection and multi-level selection. And I'm not going to get into the weeds of that, but there is an evolutionary foundation and theoretical foundation for talking about the evolution of sociality. Okay, when I looked at agricultural insects and humans that engaged agriculture again, I noticed that their capacity for sociality was extended in a very specific way with agriculture. Mainly, the division of labor was elaborated and extended around the focal point of cultivation. And this helped, again, to create very positive feedback mechanisms, feedback loops, and a cohesion in that division of labor, that collective division of labor and the elaborate division of labor around cultivation created a cohesion in these agricultural groups. These are actually not very good pictures because the elaborate division of labor that develops creates insect economic superorganisms that are absolutely vast, and it's the same with human populations. Okay, a different energetics takes place. Humans become engaged in this expansionary interdependent whole, a different kind of energetic system. In these ways, the agricultural system is universal. Okay. And it is what I call, and very different species evolve in very similar ways. The agricultural species, the agricultural system turns the species that engage it into what I have labeled an economic superorganism, a new whole. So humans go from being Homo sapiens sapiens to what I call Homo sapiens agriculturali, okay? Members of the economic superorganism. Unlike agricultural humans, hunting and gathering humans were not involved in an expansionary interdependent system, these people on the left here, in the way that they became after they make the transition to agriculture. So agriculture is a completely different economic system with totally different energetics, and it ultimately ends us up here, okay, in that kind of profound change. Okay, so again, agriculture is a universal system with unique energetics, powerful feedback loops. It's a cohesive kind of self-referential system, and it has a different interpretation of human sociality. Okay, now let's step into the weeds for just a minute. In humans, the agricultural revolution is about the coevolution of annual grains, okay, and social humans. That is, humans with evolved sociality. And viewing it in this way moves us away from our long-standing narratives that it was about human ingenuity coming to the rescue of humans when humans ran up against bottlenecks, as they always did, because they are by nature expansionary. Okay, that's an old narrative. and it's one I categorically disagree with. For the vast majority of human history, humans lived in a non-expansionary, minimalistic life embedded in the rhythm and dynamic of the more than human world. This was an economic system with entirely different feedback mechanisms and an entirely different expression of sociality. And it set humans on an entirely different relationship with the earth. Okay, so I want you to be clear about that. Humans have the capacity to engage different economic systems. Okay, we can see that when we look at these slides here. These are vastly different kinds of economic systems, right? But the other complexity is that agriculture is not just a matter of culture, because insect superorganisms engage agriculture and they don't have culture in the way that we would define it, okay? So this too presents us with a realm of complexity that's difficult to navigate. And this got me thinking that economic systems might not be as intentional as we think they are. And once we get caught up in them, it might be very difficult to change a trajectory. I think that's important in and of itself to think about, especially given our present moment where we don't seem to be able to budge the present economic system we're caught up in. Okay. Now, agriculture was a reinterpretation and refocusing of human sociality. Culture, division of labor, tribalism all preceded agriculture, developing through a process of group and multi-level selection. But this predisposition comes in contact with annual grains at the beginning of a Holocene, and a different kind of interpretation, embodiment of sociality occurred with the coevolution with annual grains. Understand, first of all, that there were external factors that led to the agricultural revolution. And these external factors, humans had nothing to say about, or nothing, they weren't involved in it. There was the Holocene warming, which created a warmer climate and more stable climate. There was the presence themselves of annual grains, okay? And there was a largesse of soil carbon that had been left in soils after the receding glaciers in the Pleistocene. So all of these are external factors that influence the agricultural revolution in humans. But there are all kinds of things about humans, specific to humans and specific to annual grains, and the interplay of the two that help to create this kind of expansionary cohesive system. I've already talked to you about the human capacity for division of labor, okay? It was a great benefit to develop this kind of plasticity, cultural ability during the climatic changes of the Pleistocene. It was a survival adaptation that worked very well for humans. Humans with this plasticity encounter climate change and a greater abundance of annual grains, wild annual grains, that they can now harvest. So if you think about kind of the expansion of the division of labor in very simplistic terms, the division of labor expands even in the sense that they're harvesting more annual grains. They're still hunters and gatherers, but they're harvesting more annual grains. And that's additive to their culture and their society. It creates an added complexity. And they have the ability to add that complexity and to adapt quickly because they're cultural, okay? That gives them that quick adaptation. And as they begin to take advantage of these annual grains, they become more sedentary. That likely begins the process of changing reproductive rates, because sedentary humans are more reproductively expansive than non-sedentary humans. And so you can see a system start to engage. But we also need to understand that annual grains have their own expansive dynamic when they come in contact with humans, okay? For one thing, annual grains can be stored, and they are planted every year. So in any year, the offtake that you get is indeterminate. It depends on the year. So in an environment like that, where you're becoming more dependent on annual grains, it becomes important to maximize production in any one year because you don't know what the next year is going to bring, okay? Annual grains are also expansive in the sense that they are an absolutely horrible option for soil, okay? There's soil erosion, soil depletion around annual grains, and the way that you counteract that soil erosion and soil depletion is expansion. And humans can expand in some sense because they have technological ability, which helps them to do that, like irrigation, okay? Annual grains are also easily standardized, and they work really well for a species that has a capacity for a division of labor because they're standardized and routinized, and you can routinize and standardize the cultivation, the harvesting, the planting, the hoeing of annual grains, okay? And that gives you certain efficiencies in annual grain production, which also pushes that expansionary dynamic of annual grains. So you get this kind of interplay, if you want to call it a coevolution of humans and annual grains, that creates a condition where you have humans more fully involved in agricultural production, and they become a more cohesive, interdependent society. It's also the case that you can't ignore kind of the feedback. This is what we become with agriculture, and you can't ignore the feedback mechanisms that are uniquely human, like, for example, patriarchy, hierarchy, the extended division of labor around surplus. Those all form feedback loops that feed into the expansionary system, okay? And so what you get out of this coevolutionary process, if you will, this meeting of annual grains and social humans in the Holocene, what you get out of that is this highly interdependent expansionary system around cultivation, and a unique kind of interpretation of sociality, an interpretation of sociality where people are becoming more like cogs in a machine, okay? And that machine being the economic superorganism. So if I was to summarize this complexity, I'd say the things to keep in mind are that agriculture is a universal system. Agricultural systems have a certain structure and dynamic, okay? They're a unique interpretation of sociality. Agriculture is not a simple story of human ingenuity. And when we look at the agricultural revolution, we have to ask ourselves whether an economic system is cultural and whether it is intentional. Because it seems to me that in the 10,000 years after agriculture, most of culture, our advances in technology and know-how, our institutional frameworks, all of that. Think about the evolution of markets as an institutional interpretation of surplus, and then the form that markets take in capitalism. These cultural, institutional kinds of aspects of human beings seem to augment this expansionary sort of cohesive system and catapult it forward. They don't generally run against it. Capitalism, as I'll talk about on the 8th, is the apogee of the agricultural system. The form of surplus has changed somewhat, okay? It is what I call a system within a system. So it's the legacy of the agricultural system, but it has its own particularities, which we'll talk about it. And what I want to also emphasize in summary is that I've taken you here into what I consider a sort of deep materialism. It's a materialism that actually doesn't see the social and the biophysical as separate, but sees them as intermingling and co-evolving. And that's, I think, how we have to view an economic system. The economic system is not something here social that is then connected to the biophysical world. Its very formation and structure and dynamic is part of that co-evolutionary process, okay? And by looking at the agricultural revolution, we're able to look at a different time too, where humans were embedded in their economic life, in the rhythm and dynamic of the more than human world. It was a very different kind of economic system because the agricultural system creates something very different. We are reduced to the metronome, as James Scott says, of the annual grains, okay? Are the vast kind of spectrum of ecologies and cycles get reduced to the cycle of annual grains, okay? And that's what happens to us in agriculture. So we also, by looking at things in this way, are able to begin to think about what does real rapprochement with Earth mean now? Okay, so I'll leave you with that thought. And then on the 8th, I'll talk more completely about the economic superorganism in its capitalist form. Thank you.